Welcome, dear listener, to another tranquil journey through the annals of history. As you settle into your cozy bed or favorite armchair, and we get ready to dive into tonight's trip into medieval times, I invite you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. It's always warming to know how vast our community of nocturnal historians reaches. If you enjoy these calm, meandering explorations of the past, consider subscribing to join our little community of history lovers seeking a restful night's sleep. Tonight, we embark on a journey back to the age of chivalry, to a time of shining armor, fluttering banners, and clashing swords. The life of a medieval knight has long captured the imagination, conjuring images of gallantry, valor, and courtly love. But behind the romantic veneer lies a harsher reality, one of brutality, suffering, and ceaseless warfare. As you drift off to sleep, let us peel back the layers of myth and legend to uncover the true nature of knighthood. Ours is not a tale of fairy tale castles and dashing heroes, but of mud, blood, and the struggle to survive in a violent and unforgiving age. Picture, if you will, a typical medieval battlefield, a sprawling morass of muck and filth, trodden beneath the hooves of war horses. The air hangs heavy with the stench of sweat, smoke, and loosened bowels. A cacophony of sound assaults the senses, the clash of steel against steel, the thud of arrows finding their mark, the agonized screams of the dying. This is the world of the knight. But how did these warriors come to be? Let us begin at the beginning, with the origins and training of the medieval knight. In the chaotic centuries following the fall of Rome, a new social order began to take shape across Europe. With the rise of feudalism came a new class of elite mounted warriors, sworn to serve their lords in exchange for land and status. The path to knighthood was a long and arduous one, typically beginning in boyhood. A young noble, often no more than 7 years old, would be sent away to serve as a page in a lord's household. There, he would learn the ways of courtly etiquette, honing his skills in riding, hunting, and hawking. As he grew into adolescence, the page would graduate to the role of squire, now responsible for assisting his knight in battle and on the tournament field. He would learn to wield the heavy weapons of his trade, the sword, the lance, the mace, building strength and endurance through a punishing regimen of martial training. The squire's education was not merely physical, but moral and spiritual as well. He was steeped in the code of chivalry, a complex set of ideals encompassing bravery, honor, loyalty, and courtly love. To be a knight was to aspire to a higher calling, to serve as a paragon of Christian virtue in a world steeped in sin. Consider the story of William Marshall, often hailed as the greatest knight of his age. Born into a minor noble family, William was given over as a hostage at the age of 5, a surety for his father's loyalty to the English crown. When his father later defied the king, young William's life was forfeit. But fortune smiled upon the boy, struck by his bravery in the face of death. The king spared his life and sent him to Normandy to be trained as a knight. William's rise was meteoric. As a young squire, he distinguished himself in the tourneys and melees of the day, quickly earning a reputation for skill and daring. He caught the eye of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of England, who appointed him to her household and helped launch his career as a knight in the service of the Plantagenet kings. But for all his prowess on the tournament field, William Marshall's true mettle would be tested on the battlefield. His life was one of almost ceaseless warfare, fighting for his Plantagenet overlords in France, Normandy, and the Holy Land. He embodied the chivalric ideal, a paragon of loyalty and valor, even as the brutal realities of medieval combat swirled around him. And brutal they were. As the feudal order matured, so too did the arms and armor of the knight. By the 12th century, the knight was a formidable figure, clad head to toe in mail and plate, astride a massive destrier bred for war. Each piece of the knight's panoply was a work of artistry and engineering. The helm, with its fluttering crest and narrow eye slit, became an icon of the age. The hauberk, a tunic of interlocking mail rings, deflected slashing blows and absorbed the shock of impact. Gauntlets and greaves protected the extremities, while spurs of finely worked metal goaded the knight's mount into the fray. Atop this glittering carapace, a surcoat emblazoned with heraldic devices allowed friend and foe alike to identify the knight on the field of battle. For in the chaotic press of medieval combat, there were few means to distinguish friend from foe. A knight's weapons were tools of death, honed to a keen edge and wielded with brutal efficiency. The lance, that iconic implement of the joust, found its true home on the battlefield, couched under the arm to strike with bone-shattering force. The sword, both a symbol of status and a deadly weapon, could cleave through mail and cut down foes with ease. Maces, warhammers, and battle axes smashed through armor and bone, while the humble dagger delivered the coup de grace to fallen opponents. And then there was the knight's steed, a weapon in its own right. The destrier, towering and muscular, was clad in its own armor, the chanfron to protect the head, the crenay for the neck, the patrol to shield the chest. Its hooves were deadly, capable of crushing a fallen foe or lashing out in a melee. But such equipage came at a steep cost. Outfitting a knight for battle was a staggeringly expensive proposition. A full suit of armor could cost the equivalent of a small manor, while a warhorse might command the annual income of a prosperous merchant. The cost of maintaining a knight and his retinue was a heavy burden on medieval society, one that would ultimately contribute to the decline of feudalism and the rise of professional armies. And what of the men beneath the armor? For all the trappings of chivalry and honor, the reality of a knight's life was one of unremitting hardship and danger. Battle was a chaotic and terrifying affair, a swirling melee of horses and men, of mud and blood and the reek of loosened bowels. Imagine the fear of the knight on the eve of battle, steeling himself for the horror to come. He might spend the night in prayer, confessing his sins and making peace with his maker. At dawn, he would don his armor with the aid of his squires, a process that could take hours. Then, with a last sip of wine and a blessing from the priest, he would mount his steed and take his place in the line of battle. The chaos of medieval combat defies description. With visibility limited by the narrow eye slits of his helm, the knight could see little beyond the press of bodies around him. The din of battle was deafening. The clash of swords, the cries of the wounded, the screams of terror and rage. Wounds were horrific, inflicted by weapons designed to pierce, crush, and maim. A knight might suffer shattered bones, severed limbs, or deep gashes that festered and oozed. Infection was rampant, and medical care was rudimentary at best. Many knights suffered a slow, agonizing death from wounds that would today be considered treatable. For the knight who survived the initial clash of arms, the aftermath of battle was scarcely less harrowing. The field was a charnel house, littered with the dead and dying. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, while scavengers, both human and animal, picked over the corpses in search of plunder. Capture was a fate perhaps worse than death. A knight taken prisoner could expect to be ransomed back to his family or liege lord, often at ruinous cost. But for those who could not afford the price of freedom, a life of slavery or imprisonment awaited. Many knights languished for years in enemy dungeons, enduring unspeakable privations and torments. The psychological toll of such experiences can scarcely be overstated. Knights bore witness to scenes of horrific carnage, watching friends and comrades hacked down in the prime of life. They endured the guilt of survival, the anguish of loss, the ever-present spectre of their own mortality. Consider the account of Jean de Joinville, companion and biographer of King Louis IX of France, who accompanied his liege on the ill-fated Seventh Crusade. In his memoirs, Joinville recounts the harrowing aftermath of the Battle of Mansoura in 1250, where the French army was routed by the Mamluk of Egypt. Sights of pain and woe met our eyes. One saw wounded and dead on every hand. The field of battle was strewn with corpses, and the river ran red with blood. Headless bodies and limbless trunks littered the ground, and the stench was so great that one could hardly endure it. And one heard nothing but the groans of the dying and the lamentations of the wounded crying for help, which was but little use. It was a doleful thing to see so many brave men perish. This, then, was the reality of knighthood, not the shining ideal of chivalry and valor, but a brutal and bloody struggle for survival in a world riven by violence. And yet, for all the horror and hardship, the allure of knighthood persisted. Why? Part of the answer lies in the pervasive power of myth and legend. The knights of romance and epic, of Arthurian lore and chansons de geste, bore little resemblance to their historical counterparts. They were paragons of virtue, models of courtly grace and valor, untainted by the sordid realities of war and politics. These idealized knights served a vital social function, embodying the values and aspirations of a culture steeped in violence. They offered a glimpse of a higher calling, a code of conduct that elevated the raw brutality of feudal society into something nobler and more refined. But the chivalric code was always more ideal than reality. For every knight who upheld the lofty principles of honor and virtue, there were countless others who betrayed them. The annals of medieval history are replete with tales of knights who were little more than glorified thugs, who plundered and raped and murdered with impunity. Consider the case of Raoul de Cambrai, a 10th century French knight whose exploits were immortalized in an epic chanson de geste. In the poem, Raoul is portrayed as a paragon of knightly virtue, a fierce warrior and loyal vassal. But the historical record paints a far darker picture. In 943, Raoul launched a brutal campaign against the town of Origny, sacking the monastery and setting fire to the church where the townspeople had sought refuge. Hundreds were burned alive, including a group of nuns who had taken shelter in the church tower. When the abbot of the monastery pleaded for mercy, Raoul had him beheaded on the spot. This was the reality of knightly warfare, not the flowery tales of chivalry and romance, but a brutal struggle for power and plunder in which the strong preyed upon the weak with impunity. The knight was a product of his time, a creature of a violent and unforgiving age. And yet, for all the brutality and horror, there was a strange seductiveness to the knightly ideal. It offered a sense of purpose and identity, a way of life that elevated the individual above the common herd. To be a knight was to be part of a select fraternity, bound by oaths of loyalty and service, united in the pursuit of glory and renown. In a world where life was often nasty, brutish, and short, the knightly ideal offered a glimpse of something higher and nobler. It was a dream worth fighting for, even if the reality often fell short of the ideal. And so the knight endured through centuries of warfare and upheaval, adapting to the changing tides of history. As feudalism gave way to the rise of the nation-state, the knight evolved into the professional soldier, the cavalryman, the officer of the line. But the myth of the knight endured, a potent symbol of a bygone age of chivalry and romance. In the popular imagination, the knight became a figure of nostalgia and longing, a reminder of a time when men were brave and true, when honor and valor still held sway. And so we come to the end of our tale, dear listener. As you drift off to sleep, ponder the strange and complex legacy of the medieval knight. A figure of myth and legend, of brutality and valor, of savagery and grace. A product of his time, and yet somehow timeless. An enduring symbol of the human struggle for meaning and purpose in a world often devoid of both. Rest well, dear listener, and dream of knights and ladies, of castles and quests, of a world where honor and virtue still hold sway. For in the end, perhaps that is the greatest gift the night has bequeathed us, a dream of something better, a vision of what we might yet become. Good night and sweet dreams. As the chaos of battle engulfed the field, knights hacked their way through the melee, their once gleaming armor now smeared with mud, blood, and viscera. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, punctuated by the screams of the maimed and dying. This was the grim reality faced by medieval knights, far removed from the romanticized tales of chivalry and honor. For a captured knight, the brutal ordeal of battle was often just the beginning. If not ransomed by his family, a prisoner of war could expect a grim fate. At best, lengthy captivity in squalid conditions awaited, with a constant threat of starvation and disease. At worst, enslavement or summary execution loomed, depending on the whims of his captors. Even for the victors, the aftermath of battle held fresh horrors. The field was a charnel house of butchered men and horses, writhing with the critically wounded, pleading for a swift end to their agony. Hacking through piles of the dead to retrieve spent arrows and strip corpses of valuables, the exhausted knights had little time to reflect on the carnage they had wrought. The psychological toll on these warriors was immense. Many would be haunted for life by the screams of fallen comrades and the sight of once vital men reduced to bloody ruin. In an age without understanding of combat trauma, knights were left to cope alone with the waking nightmares that followed them off the battlefield. One harrowing first-hand account comes from an anonymous French knight at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Outnumbered and bogged down in muddy terrain, the French knights made a disastrous cavalry charge into a bristling wall of English longbowmen. The knight describes a storm of arrows raining down as thick as snow, felling horses and sending armored riders crashing to the ground. Floundering in the muck, weighed down by his heavy plate armor, the knight became easy prey for English men-at-arms who waded into the chaos with daggers, hacking at gaps in armor to finish off the helpless French. "All around me, my countrymen were being slaughtered like cattle," he wrote. "I saw a dozen men piled one atop the other, feebly twitching in their death throes. I thank God that I was spared, but never again will I be able to sleep without hearing the screams of my butchered comrades." This stark testimony puts the lie to the glamorized depictions of medieval combat prevalent in popular lore. The chivalric code extolled martial valor, loyalty, and honor, but the reality of warfare was a world apart from these lofty ideals. On the battlefield, raw survival instincts eclipsed any notions of fair play or decorum between knights. The aim was to kill the enemy by any means necessary, and chivalric conventions quickly crumbled in the dog-eat-dog savagery of hand-to-hand combat. Treachery, mercilessness, and brutality were the order of the day, with no quarter asked or given. Knights unhorsed in battle were just as likely to be stabbed to death by peasant conscripts as taken prisoner for ransom. Mercy was in short supply, and any pleas were usually drowned out by the roar of battle and cries of the dying. Warfare was an equal opportunity horror, with high-born knights and lowly foot soldiers alike wallowing in the mud and blood. Even off the battlefield, the chivalric ideal often proved hollow. While outwardly adhering to codes of gentlemanly conduct, many knights were little more than glorified thugs, prone to drunken rampages, abductions, and vicious reprisals against those who slighted their fragile sense of honor. A notorious example was Sir Ranald de Blondeville, a 13th century English knight whose violent exploits became the stuff of grim legend. Renowned for his hair-trigger temper and love of strong drink, Blondeville was said to fly into homicidal rages at the slightest provocation. Contemporaries described him as a man of much spleen, sudden to wrath, and cruel in vengeance. In one infamous incident, Blondeville and his men-at-arms descended on a village that had failed to provide enough provisions for his hunting party. In a frenzy of violence, they torched the humble thatched cottages and barns, driving the villagers out as they tried frantically to save their scant possessions. As the people fled the conflagration, Blondeville ordered them hacked down, sparing not even women and children. Laughing maniacally amid the massacre, the knight called out, "Thus I repay boors who fail to show proper respect to their betters." The survivors were left to sift through the smouldering ruins and bury their dead. Though extreme, Blondeville's actions were not as unusual as we might wish to believe. The feudal system codified a rigid hierarchy with knights near the apex, and many felt entitled to abuse their power over the lower rungs of society. With their military prowess and lofty status, rogue knights could run amok with impunity, knowing that their noble peers would likely shield them from justice. Only when their atrocities became too egregious to ignore did knights like Blondeville face consequences. After numerous complaints about his marauding, King Henry III finally had Blondeville arrested and stripped of his landholdings. The knight died in prison a decade later, unrepentant to the last. So while the chivalric ideal held up knights as paragons of honor and virtue, all too often the reality fell woefully short. The same lionized for their battlefield valor could also be merciless brutes, capable of shocking cruelty toward the defenseless. The medieval knight occupied an uneasy space between these two extremes, at once noble warrior and hardened killer, paragon of virtue and privileged thug. The romantic image of the knight in shining armor, defending the weak and upholding the right, was always an aspirational construct, more than a reality. Still, it would be overly simplistic to paint all knights with the same grim brush. Though the historical records tend to highlight the lurid and sensational, there were those who strove to live up to the nobler aspects of the chivalric code, or at least held them as ideals worth pursuing. One such knight was Sir James Douglas, a commander in the Scottish Wars of Independence in the early 14th century. A skilled warrior and brilliant tactician, Douglas was renowned for his strong sense of justice, chivalric decorum, and compassionate treatment of prisoners and the common folk alike. Though he could be utterly ruthless in his methods against the occupying English, Douglas always directed his aggression toward legitimate military targets. He made a policy of sparing civilians and treating his captives with a respect that bordered on gentility. Even his English adversaries spoke of him with reverence, praising his courage, cunning, and impeccable conduct. When the great Scottish king Robert the Bruce died in 1329, it was Douglas who was chosen to carry out his liege's final wish, to have his embalmed heart carried on crusade and interred in the Holy Land. The knight took a solemn vow to see the task through at all costs. Embarking for the Levant with a small company of knights and men-at-arms, Douglas wore the silver casket containing Bruce's heart on a chain around his neck. But in a final act of chivalric valor, he met his end in Spain, battling Moorish cavalry while on the way to Jerusalem. Outnumbered and doomed, Douglas hurled the casket into the fray, crying out, "Lead on, brave heart, as you have always done. Douglas will follow." He plunged into the thick of battle, laying about him with his sword until he was cut down. His body was later found, bristling with arrows, draped protectively over the casket. Though he failed to complete his quest, Douglas's final stand exemplified the nobler aspects of the chivalric ethos: unflinching courage, fierce loyalty, and an all-consuming sense of duty. In death, as in life, He put service to his king and the greater glory of the chivalric ideal above his own survival. But for every James Douglas, whose deeds measured up to lofty ideals, there were dozens more Ranald de Blondevilles, for whom chivalry was merely a facade concealing the basest cruelty and selfishness. The knight's place in the feudal order was always rife with such contradictions, at once protectors and predators, gallant warriors and brutal killers. Perhaps nowhere was this duality more starkly embodied than in the practice of siege warfare. If open battle was horrific, sieges represented a special kind of hell for knights and commoners alike. The objective of a siege was to surround an enemy castle or fortified town and cut off all supply lines, literally starving the defenders into submission. With no way to forage or resupply, those inside the walls would slowly run out of food, water, and other necessities until desperation drove them to capitulate. But besieging armies often faced a grueling ordeal of their own. Assembling the men and materiel for a prolonged siege was a massive undertaking, requiring prodigious supplies and logistical support. An army of thousands camped outside the walls had to be fed, and with supply lines often stretched thin, provisions could quickly run short. For the knightly class, accustomed to a certain standard of food and drink, the Spartan rations of a siege camp could come as an unpleasant shock. Used to fine wine, rich meats, and fresh bread in their castles, knights now had to subsist on hard biscuits, salt pork, and sour ale. If the siege dragged on for months, as was often the case, even these paltry foodstuffs could dwindle, leading to widespread malnutrition. Knights found themselves growing gaunt and weak, their fine clothes hanging loose on wasted frames, dreaming of the opulent feasts they once took for granted. Nor was hunger the only hardship to be endured. Siege camps were notorious breeding grounds for disease, with so many men crammed together in unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, typhoid, and other maladies could rip through an army, leaving even the most valiant knight shivering and hollowed out, unable to keep down what little food they had. But as grim as conditions could get for the besiegers, life inside a castle under siege was even more nightmarish. With the population swelled by panicked small folk seeking shelter behind the walls, food and water supplies would be stretched to the breaking point. As the weeks dragged by and provisions dwindled, the castle's defenders were reduced to eating anything they could get their hands on. Horses, dogs, and other animals were slaughtered first, then rats and mice. When even those ran out, the starving garrison might resort to boiling leather for a thin broth or eating grass and weeds. In their desperation, some besieged castles even turned to cannibalism, carving flesh from the bodies of the recently dead. During the siege of Marat in Syria during the First Crusade, the chronicler Radulf of Khan wrote of the Crusaders' descent into this ultimate depravity. In Marat, our troops boiled pagan adults in cooking pots. They impaled children on spits and devoured them grilled. These atrocities were not committed in secret. I saw it with my own eyes. For a long time they roamed widely, snatching babies from their mothers' breasts. Though Radulf presents this evidence of the Crusaders' savagery, cannibalism in a long siege was by no means limited to one side or another. Faced with the stark choice between a horrible death by starvation or consuming human flesh, many would reluctantly opt for survival at any cost. Knights, for all their supposed nobility, were not above such desperate acts when pushed to the brink. In a culture that prized martial prowess and dying well in battle, withering away from hunger was seen as a disgraceful end unbefitting a chivalrous warrior. Better to fill your belly with forbidden meat and live to fight another day. Once again, the gnawing discrepancy between the knight's lofty ideals and the grim reality of his existence rears its head. The same man who prided himself on his exquisite manners and courtesy would readily sink his teeth into human flesh if his survival depended on it. But even if a knight was spared the horrors of cannibalism, the rigors of a long siege invariably took a heavy psychological toll. Watching his comrades succumb one by one to starvation and disease, never knowing if relief would come in time, was enough to break even the boldest spirit. Many a knight emerged from a prolonged castle siege a shell of his former self, his once strapping body reduced to a gaunt wraith, his mind shattered by privation and gnawing despair. If he survived, it could take months or years to regain his strength and banish the ghosts of the siege from his nightmares. Perhaps the most notorious example of a siege pushed to the uttermost extreme was that of Chateau Gaillard in Normandy, France, in 1204. The castle, a formidable hilltop stronghold built by Richard the Lionheart, was considered virtually impregnable. But when Richard died and his despised brother John took the English throne, the new king's French rival Philip Augustus saw his chance to reconquer Normandy. He gathered an army of over 10,000 men and laid siege to Chateau Gaillard, vowing to starve out the English garrison at any cost. The castle's thick walls and commanding position made direct assault all but impossible, so the French settled in for a long siege. The English defenders, just a few hundred strong, were steadfast at first, confident that John would soon send a relief force. But as weeks turned into months with no sign of aid, the garrison's plight grew increasingly desperate. Food stocks ran low, then ran out altogether. The knights and men-at-arms tightened their belts, chewed boiled leather, grew skeletal and hollow-eyed. When the last scrawny horses and dogs had been eaten, some of the starving soldiers resorted to carving flesh from the bodies of their fallen comrades. One knight, half mad with hunger, was even accused of snatching babies from the arms of peasant women who had sought refuge in the castle, roasting them over a fire and devouring them whole. As the siege ground on into its 6th month, the once formidable garrison was reduced to a piteous state. More walking corpses than fighting men. All thoughts of chivalry and honor had long since been supplanted by the all-consuming desperation of gnawing hunger. Finally, in March of 1204, the French breached the castle's rotted outer walls and poured into the courtyard. The emaciated defenders, too weak to even lift their swords, were quickly overwhelmed. Philip Augustus ordered the few survivors rounded up and their throats slit, as an example to any who dared defy him. Among the slain was the castle's commander, the elderly Roger de Lacy, a grizzled knight who had served 3 English kings. When his body was found, the French discovered he weighed less than 70 pounds, literally wasted away to nothing. The fall of Chateau Gaillard marked the end of English rule in Normandy and cemented the fearsome reputation of Philip Augustus. But for the knights and soldiers on both sides who endured the horror of that siege, it was an experience that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the end, despite the chivalric code's glorification of the honorable knight, many warriors suffered fates far removed from battlefield valor. Starved, diseased, butchered ignominiously, or broken in mind and spirit. The same elitism that elevated knights as a warrior caste also led them into some of the most grueling ordeals imaginable. But even the knights, who never saw the inside of a siege camp or a squalid prison cell, were touched by the grim spectre of death and disfigurement. It was an inescapable part of the job description, the dark underside of the glittering world of tournaments and courtly love. At the height of the Middle Ages, the tournament was the ultimate expression of the chivalric ideal, a grand spectacle where knights could showcase their martial skills and win glory before their adoring public. With pennants snapping, heralds blaring, and nobles cheering from the stands, the tournament was a raucous celebration of knightly valor, a world away from the grim, muddy slog of real battle. Or so it seemed on the surface. In reality, the tournament could be every bit as dangerous as a battlefield, with plenty of blood spilled and lives shattered. Though the weapons were often blunted, the combat was full contact and all too real. In the early days of the tournament, in the 11th and 12th centuries, the main event was the melee, a mock battle where two sides of mounted knights slammed together at full gallop, just like in real warfare. Though they carried blunted swords and wore specialized tournament armor to limit the risk of mortal injuries, the sheer force of impact could still be bone-shattering. Even more dangerous was the chaotic scrimmage that followed the initial charge, with dozens of knights grappling and hacking at each other in a dense press of horseflesh and steel. Crushed limbs, shattered bones, and severe concussions were par for the course, and fatalities weren't uncommon. A single well-placed blow from a mace or battle axe could cave in a helm and pulp the head within. As the tournament evolved, the melee gradually. As the sun rose over the blood-soaked fields of Agincourt, the exhausted English knights and men-at-arms wearily surveyed the carnage they had wrought. The cream of French chivalry lay dead or dying in the churned mud, their once resplendent armor now ruptured and stained crimson. Piles of contorted bodies steamed in the chill October air. Crows and camp followers had already begun to pick over the corpses, stripping them of valuables. The veteran English knight Sir Robert Babington wiped his brow with a shaking hand, smearing dried blood, sweat and grime across his weathered face. He had seen many battles in his long years of service to King Henry, but never a slaughter quite like this. The vaunted knights and nobles of France had charged the English line with the arrogant recklessness of men who believed themselves invincible, only to be scythed down in droves by the low-born archers and common foot soldiers they so despised. Sir Robert shuddered as he recalled the meaty thunk of arrows piercing armor and flesh, the screams of men and horses, the press of bodies locked in desperate struggle, blades rising and falling, seeking any gap in steel or mail to butcher the fragile flesh beneath. He had been in the thick of it, hacking and slashing, watching the life drain from young French knights who had awoken that morning never dreaming it would be their last. The chivalry and valor that minstrels celebrated in song had been nowhere in evidence on the field at Agincourt, only brute survival at any cost. For all their fine armor and weapons, the French knights had died the same as any other men, choking on their own blood, soiling themselves, crying out for their mothers. Sir Robert had seen one mortally wounded young knight, barely more than a boy, trying to hold his entrails inside the terrible wound in his belly, eyes wide with shock and dawning horror as he breathed his last. As he stood on the corpse-strewn battlefield, Sir Robert reflected that it was not chivalric myths, but hard realities like this that defined a knight's brutal existence. Their training and lives were devoted to dealing out death and suffering, and all too often, meeting a grisly end themselves. Yet for all the misery and hardships they endured, few knights would have traded their station. The promise of glory, of manners and riches and renown, of having their valiant deed extolled long after their deaths, drove them onto the battlefield again and again. Sir Robert knew he was no different. He had risen from obscurity to become one of the king's most trusted knights, admired for his prowess at tourneys and his feats of arms on many battlefields. But the acclaim and accolades felt hollow on a day like this, when he had sent so many men, some hardly more than children, to a senseless, ugly death in the mud. With a heavy sigh, Sir Robert turned away from the awful scene and began to pick his way through the corpses to where the king's banner flew above the English camp. There would be prayers of thanks to God for delivering them this great victory, and much celebration and toasting deep into the night. He would raise a cup and praise the courage of the fallen, as custom and courtesy demanded. But he would not forget the look in that dying young knight's eyes, or the feel of his sword crunching through armor and bone. Such memories would haunt him all his days, as they surely haunted any man who had seen the savage reality of warfare concealed behind the bright veneer of chivalry and knightly valor. Yet he knew that when the king called his banners again, he would not hesitate to strap on his sword and ride out once more, to win glory or death on some distant battlefield. It was his duty, his vocation, the only life he had ever known, and may God have mercy on his soul. The gathering English army made for a fearsome sight as they marched out of Calais, their armour and weapons glinting in the pale autumn sunlight. Ragged and mud-splattered from the long siege of Harfleur, they were nonetheless in high spirits, flushed with victory and the promise of plunder. The archers sang bawdy songs as they trudged along in the rear, while up ahead, the men-at-arms and knights rode in grim, determined silence, keeping a wary eye out for any sign of the French forces they knew must be gathering to oppose them. At their head rode King Henry himself, resplendent in his gilt armour, his crowned helm shining like a beacon. He was still a young man, not yet 30, but there was a hardness to his flinty gaze, and a set to his jaw that spoke of a will as implacable as iron. He had come to France not merely to reclaim his ancestral lands, but to seize the French crown itself, and he would brook no obstacle in his path. Riding at the king's right hand was Sir Thomas Erpingham, a grizzled old warrior who had served Henry's father and grandfather before him. His armour was battered and stained, and his face bore the scars of a dozen hard-fought battles, but he sat straight and tall in the saddle, his eyes alert and watchful. As marshal of the host, it was his task to order the disposition of the troops and oversee the army on the march. Erpingham reined in his horse and called for a halt as they approached a low rise. He had learned hard lessons about the perils of ambush in his long years of campaigning. It would not do to blunder blindly into a French trap. With a curt gesture, he dispatched a pair of mounted scouts to survey the road ahead. The army waited in tense silence, the only sound the snorting of horses and the creak of leather. At length, the scouts came galloping back, their horses lathered with sweat. "No sign of the French, my lord," one of them reported, sketching a hasty bow to the king from his saddle. "The road ahead is clear as far as Agincourt." Erpingham gave a satisfied nod and glanced at the king. "I mislike the quiet," he growled. "The French are up to something, you can wager on that. We must be on our guard." Henry's answering smile was wolfish. "Let them come," he said softly. "We will give them such a welcome as they will not soon forget." He raised a gauntleted fist, his blue eyes blazing with a zealot's fire. "God is with us, my lords. He will not deliver us into the hands of the French." A ragged cheer went up from the knights and men-at-arms, but Sir Thomas did not join in. He had seen too much of war to put his faith in divine favour. All the piety in Christendom would be of little avail if the French caught them at a disadvantage. As if reading his thoughts, Henry turned to him, his voice low and fierce. "We will prevail, Sir Thomas. I have sworn to take my rightful place as King of France, and by God I will not be forsworn. I mean to see the French host scattered, and their knights kneeling to offer me their swords in surrender." Erpingham bowed his head in acknowledgement. "As you say, my liege, but we must not discount the valour of the French knights, nor their numbers. They will not yield without a fierce fight." Henry's smile turned grim. "Then we shall give them one," he vowed. "Let them come against us with all their chivalry and might. We will meet them on a field of our choosing, and we will smite them hip and thigh, as Samson did the Philistines. And when we are done, France will be ours." With that, he spurred his horse forward, his knights falling in behind him with a jangle of harness and a clatter of hooves. As he watched them ride off, Erpingham felt a strange foreboding settle over him like a shroud. Henry's boldness and hunger for glory were the very image of knightly valour, but the old marshal sensed that it would be no easy victory he led them to. The French host would be eager to come to grips with them, to settle old scores and wipe away the shame of past defeats. And for all his youthful fire, Henry was no seasoned commander, not yet. If he let his pride and daring overmaster his sense, it could spell disaster for them all. With a heavy heart, Sir Thomas Erpingham spurred his own mount and rode out after his king, praying that Henry's courage and audacity would be enough to carry the day. But as he did, he could not help but recall the words of that wise old soldier Vegetius: "Let him who desires peace prepare for war." The English had come to France seeking conquest and glory. Erpingham feared that what they would find instead was a bloody reckoning. As we've seen, the life of a knight in the Middle Ages was fraught with violence, hardship, and constant danger. From their early days as pages and squires, these warriors in training endured a grueling regimen to prepare for the brutal realities of medieval combat. They honed their skills with heavy weapons, spent long hours practicing horsemanship, and steeled themselves for the chaos of the battlefield. One of the most famous knights of the Middle Ages was William Marshal, who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most renowned warriors of his time. Born in 1147 to a minor noble family, William was sent to Normandy at a young age to train as a knight in the household of William de Tancarville, a powerful baron and champion jouster. As a squire, William learned the arts of war, excelling in the martial skills that would make him a legend. He was known for his prowess with the lance and sword, as well as his incredible stamina and bravery in battle. In 1167, at the age of 20, William was knighted on the field of battle by his lord and quickly made a name for himself as a fierce and skilled warrior. But even for a knight as talented as William Marshal, the realities of medieval warfare were harsh and unforgiving. In an age before gunpowder, combat was up close and personal, with knights hacking and slashing at each other with heavy swords, maces, and battle axes. The clanging of metal on metal, the screams of the wounded and dying, the stench of blood and sweat. These were the sights, sounds, and smells that knights like William faced on a regular basis. And the dangers didn't end when the fighting was over. Captured knights were often held for ransom, with their families forced to pay exorbitant sums for their release. Those who couldn't afford to pay were sometimes enslaved or even executed. Disease was also a constant threat, with armies on campaign often succumbing to dysentery, typhoid, and other illnesses that spread rapidly in the close quarters of military camps. But despite the risks, many young men still aspired to the glories of knighthood. The chivalric code, with its emphasis on honor, courage, and loyalty, held a powerful appeal in a world that was often brutal and chaotic. Knights were celebrated in songs and stories, their deeds immortalized in the pages of history and legend. Of course, the reality of knighthood was often far removed from the romantic ideal. While some knights did strive to uphold the principles of chivalry, many others were driven by more base motivations: greed, ambition, and a thirst for violence. In a world where might often made right, it was not uncommon for knights to engage in acts of cruelty and brutality, particularly against those they considered their inferiors. One notorious example was the French knight Raoul de Coucy, who gained a reputation for ruthlessness and brutality during the 100 Years' War between England and France. In 1373, de Coucy was dispatched by the French king to put down a peasant revolt in the town of Cesena in northern Italy. When the townspeople refused to surrender, de Coucy ordered his men to storm the walls and put the inhabitants to the sword. What followed was a brutal massacre, with thousands of men, women, and children slaughtered in the streets. De Coucy himself was said to have taken sadistic pleasure in the carnage, personally executing hundreds of prisoners and ordering his men to commit acts of rape and mutilation. But even for knights like de Coucy, who reveled in violence and cruelty, the battlefield could be a terrifying and unpredictable place. In the heat of battle, Even the most skilled and experienced warriors could fall victim to a stray arrow or a well-placed blow from an enemy's sword. And in the chaotic press of bodies, with visibility limited by the narrow eye slits of a knight's helm, it was all too easy to become disoriented or separated from one's comrades. Many knights met their ends in the muddy, blood-soaked fields of France, Flanders, and other battlegrounds of the Middle Ages, their armor dented and torn, their bodies broken and lifeless. For those knights who did survive the rigors of combat, the aftermath of a battle could be almost as harrowing as the fighting itself. The sight of the dead and dying, the moans of the wounded, the stench of rotting flesh. These were the grim realities that knights had to confront in the wake of a bloody engagement. Some turned to prayer or drink to cope with the horrors they had witnessed, while others simply tried to block out the memories and move on to the next fight. But for many knights, the psychological toll of combat was a heavy burden to bear, one that would stay with them long after they had left the battlefield behind. Despite the brutality and hardship of a knight's life, however, the allure of chivalry and martial glory continued to draw young men to the ranks of knighthood throughout the Middle Ages. The chance to win renown on the battlefield, to earn the respect and admiration of one's peers, to live up to the heroic ideals celebrated in song and story. These were powerful motivators for those who aspired to the knightly life. And for some knights, the rewards of their chosen profession could be great indeed. Men like William Marshall, who rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most powerful and influential figures of his age, were living proof that skill, courage, and a bit of luck could propel a lowly knight to the heights of fame and fortune. But for every William Marshall, there were countless other knights who met a darker fate, cut down in their prime on some distant battlefield, or left to languish in the squalid dungeons of a rival lord. The life of a medieval knight was a gamble, a roll of the dice in a world where death and suffering were ever-present companions. And yet, despite the risks and the hardships, the figure of the knight endures as one of the most enduring and romantic symbols of the Middle Ages. In the pages of history and the realms of legend, knights like Lancelot, Galahad, and El Cid continue to capture the imaginations of people around the world, their tales of courage, honor, and chivalry still resonating across the centuries. But as we look back on the lives of these warriors of old, it is important to remember the reality behind the myth. The blood, the sweat, the toil, and the tears that were the true measure of a knight's existence. Theirs was a world of constant danger and hardship, where the line between life and death was often razor thin, and where the price of glory was paid in the currency of suffering and sacrifice. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for the knights of old, those brave and gallant warriors who lived and died by the sword, who faced the chaos and terror of the battlefield with courage and resolve, and who left an indelible mark on the pages of history. May their stories continue to inspire and enlighten us, even as we seek respite from the cares of the modern world in the gentle embrace of slumber. As the legendary knight William Marshall lay on his deathbed in 1219, he reflected on a life that embodied both the soaring triumphs and harrowing ordeals of knighthood in the Middle Ages. Born the younger son of a minor noble, William seemed destined for obscurity, but through sheer grit, prowess, and ambition, he would rise to become one of the most celebrated knights in Christendom, a paragon of chivalry, and serve 5 English kings. William's path to glory was forged in the grueling training that all aspiring knights endured. From the tender age of 7 or 8, noble boys like William were sent away to serve as pages in the households of powerful lords. There they learned courtly etiquette, hunting, and the art of war. The most crucial skills were honing their horsemanship and mastering the weapons of knightly combat. Around age 14, pages graduated to become squires, shields bearers and servants to a knight who would mentor them in the ways of chivalry and war. Squires trained relentlessly in a punishing regimen, donning heavy armor and repeatedly mounting and dismounting a horse to build strength and stamina. They drilled ceaselessly with sword, lance, mace, and shield, hardening themselves for battle. Marshall was a prodigy, quickly outshining his peers with his strength, boldness, and skill. He caught the eye of the greatest magnates of the realm, entering the service of his uncle, the illustrious William de Tancarville, Chamberlain of Normandy. For a squire, accompanying their lord into battle was the ultimate test before being dubbed a knight. William Marshall first tasted war in 1167 during a vicious succession crisis in England. Serving in the retinue of his uncle, the 15-year-old Marshall rode into the Battle of Drincourt against rebels who sought to depose King Henry II. Though still a squire, William fought with astonishing courage. When his warhorse was killed from under him, he refused to flee the field. Dodging blows, he grabbed another horse and surged back into the fray, turning the tide. His valor was crucial in forcing the rebels' surrender. William's exceptional martial prowess and unflinching loyalty to the crown on that blood-soaked field foreshadowed his meteoric rise. He was knighted by King Henry himself in 1170, beginning a celebrated career in which he would fight in hundreds of battles and tournaments across England, France, and the Holy Land, usually emerging victorious. His ransom after being captured by the French in 1188 was so high, a staggering £6,666, that a special martial tax was levied in England to raise the exorbitant sum, a testament to his worth as a warrior. Though a consummate soldier, William Marshall was no mere brute. He was also a shrewd politician, a skilled diplomat, and an urbane courtier, as comfortable in the feast hall as the battlefield. He served as a valued advisor to Henry II and his queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, expertly navigating the swirling intrigues of court. As a young knight, his charm and prowess won the heart of a wealthy noble widow, Isabel de Clare, whom he married after a scandalous abduction that ruffled royal feathers, but ultimately brought him lands and greater status. William Marshall's true glory was still to come. In 1189, as a renowned knight and baron, he took the cross and set out on crusade to the Holy Land alongside King Richard the Lionheart. After a grueling march across Europe and harrowing sea voyage, Marshall and his fellow crusaders finally gazed upon the sacred walls of Jerusalem. There he fought with his customary zeal against the great Muslim Sultan Saladin in a brutal war for control of the Holy City. Though Jerusalem was not retaken, Marshall's courage and leadership throughout the Third Crusade earned him fame and the sobriquet, greatest knight who ever lived. King Richard was so taken with his bravery that he inducted him into the exclusive Order of the Garter, the world's oldest chivalric order, whose members swore to be virtuous, loyal, and defend the weak. If any knight embodied those lofty ideals, it was William Marshall, who many saw as the flower of chivalry. But behind the accolades, even the greatest knights like Marshall led a punishing existence, their lives often cut short by battle, accident, or disease. Despite his gilded reputation, Marshall's world was one of almost ceaseless warfare, and he was no stranger to its horrors. He suffered many grave injuries over his long career, including a shattered kneecap, a crushed hand, and an arrow through his thigh that nearly killed him. He watched countless friends and comrades butchered in the anarchic melee of battle. A rare first-hand chronicle of Marshall's life, L'Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, recounts the ugly spectacle of men disemboweled by sword blows, their entrails spilling out, and knights howling in agony as they were hacked to pieces, blood splattering the field. Marshall himself barely escaped being torn apart by a frenzied mob after he was taken prisoner during a battle in 1188. Such grisly brushes with death were almost a nightly rite of passage, the cost of their relentless drive for land, glory, and plunder. For all Marshall's valor and chivalry, his time was an age of great brutality, when the flower of European knighthood ravaged the villages of Palestine and massacred prisoners and civilians. Even the refined Marshall was still a man of his ruthless era. He once personally hanged a crossbowman for shooting at his men when they stopped to parley with an enemy force. But Marshall was widely regarded by contemporaries as the exemplar of knightly virtue. If he could commit such acts, how much worse must have been the depravities of a villainous knight unrestrained by chivalric scruples. One such noble figure was Reynaud of Châtillon, Marshall's contemporary in the Holy Land. A minor lord from France who rose to great power in the Crusader states, Reynaud was a man of rapacious cruelty who gloried in slaughter. During a raid into Arabia in 1182, he sacked the holy city of Medina and threatened to desecrate the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad. Swearing to avenge this insult to Islam, an enraged Saladin descended on Reynaud's forces and annihilated them at the Battle of Hattin in 1887, the greatest defeat suffered by Crusaders. The captive Reynaud was brought before Saladin, who personally beheaded him. So despised was he by the Muslims for his atrocities. In many ways, Reynaud of Châtillon represented the dark shadow of knighthood, the wanton brutality and fanaticism lurking beneath the veneer of chivalry. But even the virtuous William Marshall was hardened by the horrors he witnessed. Returning to England after the Crusade, he entered the service of King John, an ill-tempered tyrant who threw the country into turmoil. During the vicious civil war that followed, Marshall was forced to lay waste to rebel holdings, burning and pillaging without mercy. At the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, Marshall oversaw a brutal operation to mine under the keep and collapse its walls. When the defenders still refused to surrender, he had 40 men hanged in front of the castle as a gruesome warning. Even more gruesomely, during the long siege of Château Gaillard in France in 1204, Marshall's forces reduced the defenders to starvation and cannibalism. Men ate their horses, then dogs, then rats, and finally resorted to eating the flesh of their dead comrades. An unspeakable horror. Such ghastly tales starkly undercut the romanticized ideal of knightly chivalry. They remind us that behind the pageantry and tales of valor, the reality of a medieval knight's life was often nasty, brutish, and short. And yet, rare men like William Marshall managed to forge greatness and a legacy that transcended the wanton violence of their age. Through his unfailing loyalty, courage, and honor, Marshall rose to become Regent of England, entrusted with safeguarding the young King Henry III and the realm after a lifetime of devoted service. In death, Marshall's legend only grew, his tomb at the Temple Church in London becoming a pilgrimage site for knights who revered him as the ultimate embodiment of chivalry. His coat of arms, a red lion on a white field, became iconic, replicated on memorials and buildings associated with him. In effigies and artwork, he was depicted as the ideal knight, brave, pious, just, and steadfast. The anonymously penned poem L'Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal mythologized his epic feats on the battlefield and jousting field, immortalizing him in the pantheon of knightly legends. Perhaps Marshall's enduring appeal across the centuries owes something to the way his story seems to exemplify the duality of the knightly ideal. A man of refinement, gentility, and honor, who was also a ruthless warrior, hardened by violence and death. In Marshall's remarkable journey from landless younger son to the pinnacle of power, we find a riveting tale of ambition, danger, and glory set against the blood and iron world of the Middle Ages. Through his life, we glimpse both the harsh realities and captivating myths that shaped our image of the medieval knight. For all his battle honors and courtly graces, however, William Marshall's existence was largely consumed by killing and preparation for killing on a staggering scale, as was the case for most knights of his time. We must be careful not to let the enduring power of chivalric myth, with its tales of errantry and valor, obscure the crueler truths. The path to knightly renown was drenched in gore and savagery, as much a curse as a blessing for the men who walked it. And yet, William Marshall's remarkable story also reminds us of the heights to which a knight could rise through courage, skill, and sheer force of will. That allure, the promise of transmuting bloodshed into glory, was a captivating dream that launched countless young men onto the hard road to knighthood, despite the perils. In death, Marshall was celebrated as the ultimate fulfillment of that grand ambition. But in life, he and his fellow knights paid a bitter price, bearing the scars and traumas of ceaseless war and witnessing horrors that would haunt them to the grave. Such was the duality of knighthood, an entrancing but savage dance with death and renown in a pitiless age of iron. As the sun rose over the blood-soaked fields of Agincourt, the battered and weary knights surveyed the carnage around them. Broken bodies, twisted and mangled, lay strewn as far as the eye could see. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid tang of smoke from smouldering fires. For the knights who had survived the hellish battle, it was a scene they would never forget. The life of a medieval knight was one of constant preparation for war. From the moment a boy began his training as a page, usually around the age of 7, he was schooled in the ways of combat. He learned to wield a sword with deadly precision, to charge fearlessly atop a warhorse, and to live by the chivalric code that demanded courage, loyalty, and honor above all else. But the reality of knighthood was far removed from the romantic tales of valor and chivalry. The training was brutal, designed to harden young men into killing machines. Pages and squires endured grueling physical drills, learning to fight through pain and exhaustion. They practiced for hours in heavy armor, swinging swords and maces until their muscles screamed in agony. One of the most famous knights of the Middle Ages was William Marshall, whose journey to knighthood was a study in determination and grit. Born the 4th son of a minor noble in 1147, William seemed destined for a life of obscurity. But through sheer skill and bravery, he rose to become one of the most celebrated warriors of his age. As a young squire, William distinguished himself in the tournaments that were the proving grounds for aspiring knights. He was a natural on horseback, quick and agile, with a keen eye for the weaknesses of his opponents. By the time he was knighted at the age of 21, he had already made a name for himself as a formidable fighter. But the tournaments were mere sport compared to the brutal realities of war. Knights like William Marshall spent their lives on the battlefield, fighting for their lords and their honor. In an age when warfare was a savage and merciless business, they faced death and dismemberment on a daily basis. The weapons and armor of a medieval knight were designed for one purpose: to kill. Over the centuries, as warfare evolved, so too did the knight's arsenal. In the early Middle Ages, knights wore chain-mail hauberks that offered some protection against sword blows, but left the legs and face exposed. By the 14th century, plate armor had become the norm, with knights encased head to toe in gleaming steel. The armor was hot, heavy, and cumbersome, weighing up to 50 pounds or more, but it offered unparalleled protection against the weapons of the day. A well-aimed blow from a sword or mace could still crush a helmet or break bones, but a fully armored knight was a formidable opponent on the battlefield. Just as important as the armor was the knight's warhorse. Bred for size, strength, and courage, these massive beasts were trained to charge into battle, trampling foot soldiers under their hooves. Like their riders, warhorses were armored for battle, with steel chamfrons covering their faces and patrals protecting their chests. Outfitting a knight for war was a staggeringly expensive proposition. A full suit of plate armor could cost the equivalent of a small manor house, and warhorses were equally pricey. Many knights went deeply into debt to equip themselves. often pawning their lands and possessions to raise the necessary funds. But for those who could afford it, the life of a knight offered the chance for glory, honor, and riches. In an age when social mobility was rare, knighthood was a path to power and prestige. Successful knights could win lands, titles, and fortunes in battle, making them the rock stars of their day. Of course, the reality of medieval warfare was far less glamorous than the chivalric ideal. The battlefield was a hellish place, a churning mass of mud, blood, and bodies. Knights hacked and slashed their way through the press of enemy soldiers, fighting in tight formations that made it impossible to swing a sword without hitting friend as well as foe. Injuries were common and often fatal. A sword blow could split a skull or sever a limb, leaving a knight to bleed out in the mud. Even a minor wound could turn deadly if it became infected, as was all too common in an age without antibiotics. Knights who survived their wounds often suffered from debilitating pain and disability for the rest of their lives. Capture was another constant threat. In the heat of battle, knights could easily be overwhelmed and taken prisoner by the enemy. For those who could afford it, ransom was the usual means of securing release. But for poorer knights, capture could mean a life of slavery or worse. The psychological toll of combat was just as devastating as the physical. Knights witnessed unspeakable horrors on the battlefield, watching friends and comrades die in agony. Many suffered from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by nightmares and flashbacks for years after the fighting had ended. One knight who left a harrowing account of the realities of medieval warfare was Jean de Bouet, a French nobleman who fought in the 100 Years' War. In his memoirs, he describes the terror and confusion of battle, the smell of blood and entrails, and the constant fear of death or capture. In a great press of knights all struggling together, there are blows given and received that no eye can see nor any tongue describe, he wrote. One can neither advance nor retire, so that perforce one stops in one place while the press lasts, like a man bound hand and foot. Despite the brutality and horror of medieval warfare, the knightly ideal remained a powerful force in European society for centuries. The chivalric code, with its emphasis on honor, courage, and protecting the weak, was held up as the ultimate standard of manly virtue. But the reality was often far different. Many knights were little more than thugs and mercenaries, fighting for plunder rather than principle. Chivalry was a flowery fiction, a thin veneer over the grim realities of war. One knight who embodied the darker side of knighthood was Raoul de Cambrai, a notorious French warlord of the 10th century. Raoul was known for his cruelty and brutality, massacring civilians and burning churches in his relentless quest for power. In one infamous incident, Raoul attacked the town of Origny, slaughtering the inhabitants and setting fire to the church where they had taken refuge. According to legend, the screams of the burning civilians could be heard for miles around. Raoul's story was later immortalized in a chanson de geste, or epic poem, that portrayed him as a tragic hero, undone by his own passions. But for the people of his time, he was a symbol of the worst excesses of knighthood, a reminder that behind the shining armor often lurked a heart of darkness. Despite the grim realities of medieval warfare, the lure of knighthood remained strong. For many young men, the chance to win glory on the battlefield was an irresistible call, even if it meant risking death or dismemberment. And for the knights who survived, the rewards could be great. Successful warriors could win lands, titles, and riches beyond their wildest dreams. They could marry into wealthy families, securing their place in the social hierarchy. But even for the most successful knights, life was often short and brutal. In an age when warfare was a way of life, few knights lived to see old age. Most died young, cut down in the prime of their lives by sword or lance. It was a fate that many knights embraced willingly, believing that a glorious death in battle was the ultimate proof of their valor. In a society that prized courage and honor above all else, to die in combat was to achieve a kind of immortality, to live on in the songs and stories of bards and troubadours. And so they rode out to war, these young men in their shining armor, knowing that each battle could be their last. They charged into the fray with reckless abandon, hacking and slashing until the field ran red with blood. And if they fell with honor, secure in the knowledge that they had lived and died as true knights. It was a brutal and unforgiving life, but one that held an enduring fascination for centuries to come. Long after the last knight had ridden off into battle, the legend of knighthood lived on, a symbol of courage, valor, and honor in a world that often seemed to have little of any of them. But for the knights who lived and died in the mud and blood of the battlefield, there was little time for legend or romance. Theirs was a world of constant danger and hardship, where survival was never guaranteed, and yet they endured, driven by a code of honor that demanded nothing less than total sacrifice. In the end, perhaps that was the true legacy of knighthood, not the shining armor or the chivalric ideal, but the unbreakable spirit of the men who wore them. In a world that was often dark and cruel, they stood as beacons of courage and resolve, reminders of the indomitable human will to endure and triumph against all odds. And so we remember them, these warriors of a bygone age, not as the knights of legend, but as the men they really were, flawed and fallible, but also brave and true. In their stories, we find echoes of our own struggles and triumphs, reminders of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of times. As we look back on the brutal life of knights on the medieval battlefield, it is easy to be horrified by the violence and carnage of their world. But it is also important to remember the courage and sacrifice of these warriors who risked everything in the name of honor and duty. Their legacy lives on, not just in the tales of chivalry and romance, but in the enduring ideals of bravery, loyalty, and self-sacrifice that they embodied. In a world that often seems more divided and uncertain than ever, we could do worse than to look to the example of the knights of old, who stood firm in the face of adversity and never wavered in their commitment to what they believed was right. It is a lesson that echoes down through the ages, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, always the chance for redemption and renewal. And so we honor the memory of the knights of the Middle Ages, not just for their bravery in battle, but for their unwavering dedication to the ideals that still guide us today. As the Crusades raged on, the knights who journeyed to the Holy Land faced not only the perils of battle, but the hardships of the long march there. The road to Jerusalem was a grueling one, spanning thousands of miles across unforgiving terrain. Knights set out from their homes in France, England, Germany with zealous hearts, their armor polished and their spirits high. But as the weeks turned to months, the toll of the journey began to wear on even the most fervent warrior of God. The sun beat down mercilessly on marching columns of crusaders, baking them in their heavy armor and sapping their strength. Water was scarce in the arid lands of Anatolia and the Levant. Men and horses alike suffered from thirst, their throats parched and their lips cracked. The knights' once shining mail was soon caked with the dust of the road, their surcoats stiff with dried sweat. At night, they shivered in the cold desert air, huddled around meager fires. Dysentery and other diseases ripped through the crusader camps, spread by tainted water and poor sanitation. Even the nobility were not immune. Many a knight spent days racked with fever and cramping, too weak to sit a horse, let alone wield a sword. The stench of sickness hung over the marching columns. Supply lines were tenuous at best in hostile territory. At times, the crusaders were forced to scavenge for food, foraging the barren landscape for anything to fill their bellies. Their horses grew gaunt, subsisting on meager rations of grain. Some knights were reduced to eating their mounts when provisions ran out. It was a far cry from the grand feasts of home. When thirst and hunger didn't claim a knight's life, the enemy often did. The march was harried by constant skirmishes with the Seljuk Turks. These lightning raids left men and horses dead, supply wagons plundered. The Turks employed unfamiliar tactics, like feigned retreats and mounted archery, bewildering the knights used to close-quarters melee. Many never even reached the walls of Jerusalem, falling to Turkish arrows on the long road east. One such knight was Reginald of Akon, the third son of a minor French noble. Reginald had taken the cross with dreams of glory, certain God would see him through to the holy city. Young and green, he marched out with a contingent led by Count Raymond of Toulouse, 5,000 men strong. But each mile beneath the blazing Syrian sun sapped a bit more of Reginald's strength and idealism. As they crossed the Anatolian plateau, Reginald's warhorse collapsed beneath him, felled by heat and thirst. He marched on foot after that, his armor chafing, his feet bleeding in his boots. Reginald silently cursed the priests who had filled his head with visions of glorious and righteous battle. There was no glory in slowly baking and starving to death before even seeing the enemy. Sickness took hold of Reginald outside Antioch, racking his body with alternating chills and fever. He shook with the ague as he huddled by the cook fires, barely able to choke down the thin gruel that was the army's only sustenance. All around him, men wasted away to walking skeletons or succumbed to disease. Each morning, the dead were piled like cordwood and set alight. The stench of roasting flesh mingled with the rot of the latrines. In the end, Reginald of Akon would not live to see Jerusalem with his own eyes. As the ragged remains of the Crusader army marched doggedly on, he slipped away in the night, delirious with fever. His bones were left to bleach beneath the Syrian sun, one more unnamed casualty of the long crusade. Reginald's dreams of righteous glory died with him on that bleak and dusty plain, a cruel lesson in the realities of holy war. While some knights did survive the grueling march to reach Jerusalem, their hardships were far from over. The city was well defended and provisioned to withstand a long siege. The Crusaders, weakened by disease and privation, threw themselves at the stout walls again and again. They fought beneath the merciless desert sun, clad in scorching mail, sweat and blood running into their eyes beneath their helms. Even the most stalwart warriors began to wonder if their suffering was truly ordained by God as the death toll mounted. Was all this agony and gore what the Pope had called them to in the name of their faith? Many began to question the very idea of holy war, even as they continued to shed blood for the cause. The First Crusade did eventually succeed in capturing Jerusalem in 1099, but at a terrible cost. Of knights who had set out so proudly from Europe, only a ragged fraction survived to see the holy city. Their once bright armor was battered, their surcoats stiff with the filth of long campaigning. The exhausted victors wept as they knelt in prayer at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but their tears were as much from trauma and sorrow as joy. The price of taking the city had been paid in blood and anguish. Many knights were too sickened by what they had seen and done to revel in their success. Even in triumph, the Crusaders could not shake the bone-deep weariness, the nightmares of fallen comrades, the knowledge of their own capacity for butchery. The myths of chivalry felt hollow indeed beside the heaps of rotting dead. Those knights who did survive to return home were deeply changed by their experiences, and not for the better. Men who had dreamed of holy glory came back haunted, quick to anger, unable to readjust to peace. They drank away the memories or revisited the violence of the Crusades on their own people. The once lucrative tournament circuit saw a marked increase in brutality as former Crusaders reveled in the blood sport. A few knights turned their backs on the secular world altogether, trading their blood-soaked swords for the ascetic life of the monasteries. They hoped to atone for the horrors they had wrought in the Holy Land, to scourge away the stains on their souls. Others simply withdrew from public life, unable to shake the weight of what they had seen and done. The Crusades had left an indelible mark on the men who fought them, a stark lesson in the real cost of holy war. The legendary figure of the chivalrous knight on crusade, nobly sacrificing all for his faith, largely ignorant of the grim realities faced by the men who took the cross. The long road to Jerusalem was a hellish trial of thirst, hunger, and disease. Holy battle was waged by desperate, brutalized men pushed to the limits of endurance. Many who survived the march and the siege would spend the rest of their lives grappling with the scars, both physical and spiritual. The Crusades revealed the yawning gulf between the myth of the pious warrior and the harrowing truth of religiously motivated conflict. The knights who took part learned firsthand the cruelty and trauma of holy war, a lesson paid for in blood and anguish that haunted them long after the battles were done. As we've seen, the life of a knight was one of grueling training, constant warfare, and brutal violence, whether on the muddy battlefields of Europe or the scorching sands of the Holy Land during the Crusades. But some knights found another outlet for their martial prowess and thirst for glory: the tournament. The tournament was a grand spectacle in the Middle Ages, a festival of pageantry, sport, and martial skill. It evolved from the chaotic mock battles of the 11th century into a more structured event by the 12th and 13th centuries, with individual jousts, melees, and archery contests. For knights, it was a chance to showcase their abilities, win prize money, and the adoration of the crowds. For the common folk, it was a raucous entertainment, a chance to bet on their favorite knights, feast, drink, and revel. But for all its fanfare and spectacle, the medieval tournament was a dangerous affair. Even with blunted weapons, knights could suffer severe injuries from lance strikes or falls from their mounts. At a tournament in 1240, some 80 knights were reportedly killed in a single melee, a shockingly high toll for what was meant as sport and entertainment, rather than actual warfare. Many knights lived for the glory and thrill of the tournament, spending lavishly on fine armor and horses, betting huge sums on themselves. William Marshal, one of the most celebrated knights of the 12th century, made his fortune and fame on the tournament circuit before becoming Regent of England. As a young knight, Marshal was said to have captured 500 knights and their horses for lucrative ransoms over his long tournament career. The tournament was in many ways the pinnacle of chivalric culture, with its elaborate rituals, heraldry, and codes of conduct. Knights would parade in their finest armor, with richly caparisoned horses and colorful pennants, as noble ladies looked on, choosing champions and awarded favors. The tournaments reinforced the ideals of chivalry, valor, honor, loyalty, courtly love, however far removed those ideals often were from the grim realities of war. Some knights became tournament stars, celebrated for their prowess and panache, like the 14th century French knight Jean Le Mangre, known as Boucicaut. A veteran of the Crusades and countless battles, Boucicaut was also a tournament champion, famed for his flamboyant style and showmanship. He would ride into the lists wearing extravagant costumes, accompanied by musicians and minstrels singing his praises. But for every Boucicaut or William Marshal, there were countless other knights for whom the tournament was a risky gamble, a chance to win glory and prize money, but at the risk of injury, death, or financial ruin. Many knights staked everything on their tournament performances, borrowing heavily to pay for expensive armor, horses, and entourages, hoping to win it all back in prizes and ransoms. If they failed, they could find themselves deep in debt, forced to sell off lands or even their knighthood to pay their creditors. The 15th century Burgundian knight Jacques de Lalaing was celebrated for his tournament victories, but died in battle at age 33, leaving behind massive debts his family struggled to pay. For all its pageantry and chivalric ideals, the tournament was a reflection of the knight's life, a constant striving for glory, fame, and fortune, but at a heavy cost. It was a microcosm of the feudal world, with its rigid hierarchies, codes of honor, and casual brutality. It celebrated martial prowess above all else, elevating the knight as the pinnacle of medieval society, even as the realities of knighthood were often far less noble. As the Middle Ages waned, so too did the tournament culture. Gunpowder weapons made the knight increasingly obsolete on the battlefield, and the elaborate rituals and pageantry of the tournament began to seem increasingly antiquated. By the 16th century, tournaments were more ceremonial than martial, more about spectacle than actual combat. But the legacy of the tournament, and of the knight as a chivalric ideal, lived on in literature, art, and popular imagination. The romantic image of the knight in shining armor, fighting for honor and love, became a staple of medieval romances and poetry. It shaped the ideals of courtly love and chivalry that still resonate in our cultural imagination today, even as the realities of the knight's life were often far less romantic. The story of the knight is one of contradictions, of soaring ideals and brutal realities, of glory and suffering, of romance and violence. It is the story of a warrior elite who dominated the battlefields and tournaments of medieval Europe, who shaped its culture and values, and whose legacy still echoes through the centuries. From the muddy fields of Agincourt to sun-baked walls of Jerusalem, from the glittering halls of medieval castles to the bloody melees of the tournament grounds, the knight left an indelible mark on the Middle Ages. His story is one of valor and villainy, of chivalry and savagery, of humanity at its most noble and most brutal. As we look back on the knight from the distance of centuries, it is easy to romanticize or condemn him, to see him as a paragon of virtue or a symbol of oppression. But to truly understand the knight, we must try to see him in the context of his time, with all his flaws and contradictions. The knight was a product of a world very different from our own, a world of constant warfare, rigid social hierarchies, and deep religious conviction. He was shaped by the values and beliefs of his age, by the harsh realities of life in the Middle Ages, and by the never-ending struggle for power and glory. In the end, the knight's story is a deeply human one, a story of courage and cowardice, of loyalty and betrayal, of faith and doubt. It is the story of men who aspired to high ideals, but who were also capable of great cruelty and violence. It is the story of a warrior elite who dominated their world through force of arms, but who were also bound by codes of honor and chivalry. As we remember the knight in all his glory and infamy, we are reminded of the complexities and contradictions of the human experience, of the ways in which we are shaped by our times and our cultures, and of the enduring power of the stories we tell about ourselves and our past. The knight may be a figure of the distant past, but his stories still resonate with us today, as a reminder of the heights and depths of the human spirit, and of the never-ending struggle for meaning and purpose in a world that is often brutal and unforgiving. In the end, the knight's story is our story, the story of humanity in all its flawed and magnificent complexity. And so we come to the end of our journey through the brutal life of the medieval knight, from the muddy battlefields of Europe to the arid plains of the Holy Land, from the training grounds of the castle to the bloody melees of the tournament. We have seen the knight in all his guises, the pious crusader and the ruthless warlord, the courtly lover and the brutal fighter, the noble hero and the ignoble villain. We have seen the world that shaped him, a world of constant warfare, rigid social hierarchies, and deep religious conviction. And we have seen the legacy he left behind, a legacy of chivalry and brutality, of romance and violence, of soaring ideals and harsh realities. The knight may be gone, but his story lives on, in the tales we tell and the dreams we dream, in the ideals we aspire to, and the realities we confront. In the end, the story of the knight is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, to our capacity for both great good and great evil, for both noble sacrifice and brutal self-interest. It is a reminder that we are all products of our times and our cultures, shaped by the world around us even as we seek to shape it in turn. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us dream of knights and ladies, of castles and tournaments, of a world long gone but never forgotten. Let us remember the knight in all his flawed and magnificent humanity, and let us strive, in our own ways, to live up to the ideals he embodied, even as we learn from his mistakes and shortcomings. For in the end, the story of the knight is the story of us all, the story of the never-ending struggle to find meaning and purpose in a world that is often brutal and unforgiving. It is a story of courage and cowardice, of loyalty and betrayal, of faith and doubt. And it is a story that will continue to be told, as long as there are those who dream of a better world and who are willing to fight for it. Good night, and sweet dreams of knights and chivalry, of a world that was and a world that could be. May we all find the courage to face our own battles and the wisdom to learn from those who came before us. As we've seen, the life of a medieval knight was often nasty, brutish, and short. But some knights still managed to rise above the constant warfare and bloodshed to achieve legendary status in their own lifetimes. One such knight was Sir William Marshal, who served 5 English kings in the 12th and 13th centuries. Born the younger son of a minor noble, William had to make his own way in the world. He began his career as a humble household knight and ended it as Regent of England, the most powerful man in the realm. William first made his name on the tournament circuit, a full-contact sport in that era. In one early tournament, he supposedly captured 500 knights and seized their horses, arms and armor as prizes. This windfall allowed him to form his own sizable retinue of knights and launch his military career in earnest. Rising through the ranks, William became known for his prowess as a warrior, but also his unwavering loyalty and chivalric conduct. While fighting for King Henry II against rebels, William's own father allied with the enemy. Torn between family and feudal oaths, William ultimately stayed true to his king. After the decisive battle, Henry ordered the execution of the rebel leaders, including William's father. But William fell to his knees and pleaded for mercy. Moved by this show of both loyalty and compassion, the king relented. William's father was spared. This adherence to chivalric virtues set William apart in an age when many knights behaved more like thugs than noblemen. He was no saint. William profited handsomely from warfare and could be utterly ruthless to his enemies. But he usually tried to temper the brutality of war with basic humanity and fair treatment of foes. William's finest hour came during the civil war that erupted when King John faced a massive rebellion by his own barons. William, now a grizzled veteran 70 years of age, was tasked with protecting the young son of the hated king. After King John unexpectedly died of dysentery amidst the turmoil, William stepped up and took control. Through skilled diplomacy, he negotiated a settlement between the warring factions and restored order to the fractured kingdom. He reissued Magna Carta, the historic charter of rights the barons had forced John to sign. This shrewd and conciliatory move helped reunite England after years of bitter conflict. Despite wielding near absolute power, William proved an able and responsible regent, capably guiding the kingdom until the boy king came of age. He died peacefully in his bed at 72, an astonishing feat for a knight who had spent his long life on battlefields. The glowing chronicle of William's life, commissioned by his own family, was one of the first biographies of a knight ever written. It set the mold for the perfect knight, an ideal warrior who was fierce to enemies but compassionate to the weak, bound by oath and honor in a lawless age. But William was an exception among the knights of his day. For every virtuous knight like the Marshal, there were many more who fell woefully short of chivalry's lofty ideals. Ramon Mercader was a Catalan knight and mercenary captain who won renown for all the wrong reasons in 14th century Spain. He fought not for king and country, but for his notorious mercenary company known as the Almogavars. Hardened veterans of the wars between Aragon and Castile, the Almogavars sold their swords to whichever ruler would pay them. Loyalty was an alien concept to these hard-bitten professional soldiers. In 1303, the Byzantine Emperor Andronicus hired Mercader and 6,500 Almogavars to help him fight off invading Turks in Anatolia. Mercader and his men succeeded in repelling the Turkish threat, but their astounding brutality shocked even the battle-hardened Byzantines. The Almogavar method of war was simple and unsubtle: burn, pillage, and butcher everything in their path, soldier and civilian alike. Mounted on swift horses, they would streak ahead of the main army like a scythe, leaving a trail of torched villages, trampled fields, and disemboweled peasants in their wake. Even their Christian Byzantine employers were horrified by the depravity of Mercader and his men. Byzantine records describe the Almogavars' standard practice after taking a town. They would first compel the leading citizens to hand over their wealth on pain of death. Once the movable loot was secured, they put the entire population to the sword. Every man, woman, and child hacked to pieces. The chronicle of the Byzantine historian Pachymeres relates one especially grim episode. After sacking a Turkish town, Mercader and his Almogavars impaled all the surviving inhabitants on wooden stakes. Thousands of men, women, and children left to writhe in agony under the burning sun. They then lit a massive bonfire using furniture from the emptied houses and celebrated their victory by feasting and carousing amidst the awful forest of impaled bodies. Such acts were not the regrettable excesses of war, but standard operating procedure for Mercader's company. With allies like these, the Byzantines soon began to regret hiring the Almogavars, who they came to regard as savages and brutes. But the emperor could hardly complain. He had knowingly employed these butchers to terrorize his Turkish enemies, a task they performed with gusto. The uneasy alliance fell apart after Mercader and his men routed the Turks and forced a peace settlement. With the war over and their pay drying up, the Almogavars began ravaging Byzantine lands with the same ferocity they had shown the Turks. Incensed, the emperor terminated their contract, but foolishly tried to cheat them out of their agreed wages. Mercader was outraged at this betrayal. He led his men back toward Constantinople, burning towns, looting monasteries, and slaughtering all in their path. The emperor hastily sent wagons laden with gold to belatedly pay the Almogavars off before they could threaten the capital. It was a craven and humiliating capitulation by a ruler who had unleashed a monster he could no longer control. Having wrung the Byzantines dry, Mercader next offered his services to the Latin Prince of Achaia, a Frankish crusader state in Greece. Here, the Almogavars plumbed new depths of atrocity. Byzantine records accuse them of roasting babies on spits and using their dismembered mothers' bodies as benches while feasting. Even accounting for cultural animosity and wartime propaganda, the consistency of such grisly reports attests to the unique savagery of Mercader and his dreaded company. Rightly feared across the Mediterranean, Mercader ultimately ended his long and bloody career as a made man in Sicily, richly rewarded for his decades of carnage in gold and estates. While the rapacious Mercader represented the worst of his profession, most knights fell somewhere between the lofty example of Martial and the wanton cruelty of Mercader. The reality of knightly life was often grim, brutal, and short, with few finding glory or riches at the end of their hard road. Consider the experience of an ordinary French knight in the 13th century. Born into a poor but noble family, he would be packed off to the household of a higher-ranking lord around the age of 7 to begin his training. As a lowly page, he waited on the lord's table, ran errands for his lady, and endured cuffed ears from the castle chaplain during Latin lessons he could barely understand. Around 14, he would graduate to squire, assisting the knight he served with dressing, grooming his warhorse, cleaning his armor and weapons, and accompanying him on campaign. In battle, the squire would lead up his master's spare horses and guard his prisoners. If his knight was unhorsed in the press of battle, the squire would rush in to supply a fresh mount or drag his wounded lord to safety if he fell. It was hazardous, unglamorous work. Many a squire died in harness before ever attaining knighthood themselves. At 21, a squire would finally be dubbed a knight, usually on the eve of his first battle or after distinguishing himself in combat. In a solemn ceremony, the lord he served would strike him on the shoulders and head with the flat of his sword. The blows symbolized the last time he would endure chastisement without answering in kind. Now a made knight, he would remain in the service of his lord, fighting his wars and enforcing his will on the populace. Mounted on an destrier warhorse and clad in full armor, he would have made an imposing figure on the battlefield. But for all their vaunted warrior prowess, knights faced terrifying risks in combat. The elite cavalry charges that epitomized knightly warfare were always a gamble. A well-timed countercharge could turn a thundering wall of horseflesh and steel into a tangled massacre in a matter of moments. Assuming our knight survived his first clash of lances unscathed, the press of battle quickly devolved into a chaotic melee in which he would hack and bludgeon his way through the throng. Jammed into the crush of bodies, exhausted from heat and thirst, he ran the risk of having his horse killed from under him. Falling beneath the hooves of his comrades' mounts, he could be trampled to death in an instant. Assuming he managed to drag himself from the muck and blood of the battlefield, a knight who had acquitted himself bravely might be taken for ransom by his foes if captured. But all too often, those judged too poor to be worth ransoming were brutally executed where they lay. Many a young knight who dreamed of martial glory met his end, with his throat slit in a corpse-strewn field, his armor stripped off before his body had even grown cold. If taken alive, an unfortunate knight of meager means would face grim prospects. Chained and dragged off to the enemy's castle, he could languish for years in a dank dungeon while his family frantically tried to raise the steep price of his freedom. Some knights died in captivity or had to be ransomed by the efforts of the whole community. Such was the harsh fate of those who lost out at the brutal game of war in the Middle Ages. While a few elite knights won fame and fortune from their martial exploits, for the ordinary knight, warfare was a path to pain, penury, or a premature grave. In an era when virtually all fighting was hand-to-hand, even the victor was guaranteed a share of hardship and bodily hazard. Assuming he survived his military service with life and limb intact, a typical knight could look forward to settling down in austere comfort, lorded over his manor by the grace of his feudal master. So long as he didn't run afoul of his overlord's whims or displease the church, his battered soul could find some late repose as a petty tyrant of his local patch. But when his lord's summons came again, he would strap on his sword, don his dented helm, and march toward the horizon to inflict and endure the brutal cycle of bloodletting once more. Such was the harsh lot of even the most ordinary and unremarkable of knights in the Middle Ages. While the gleam of knightly legend still captures imaginations today, the reality for the faceless figures who lived, bled, and perished by the thousands in the mud of medieval battlefields was often anything but glorious. The towering knights, in shining armor we picture, were men of their cruel times, and the line between chivalric ideal and blood-soaked reality could be perilously thin indeed. As we've seen, the life of a medieval knight was filled with hardship, violence, and constant peril. But for all the misery and brutality they endured, knights were also seen as the flower of nobility, famed for their valor, piety, and chivalric virtues. This idealized image was spread through epic poems, songs, and tales that mythologize their greatest deeds and noblest qualities. One such legendary knight was Roland, a key figure in the epic poem The Song of Roland, which romanticized the age of Charlemagne. As a paladin of the emperor's court, Roland was the epitome of the fearless, loyal warrior. In the story, Roland fights valiantly as the rearguard of Charlemagne's army, but is overwhelmed and killed in a heroic last stand against the Saracens. With his dying breath, Roland blows his oliphant horn to warn Charlemagne, then tries to destroy his sword Durandal to keep from the enemy, but the blade proves indestructible, shattering the rocks around him. This epic of sacrifice, honor, and martial prowess helped cement Roland as the ideal knight for centuries to come. Countless works of art depict his final moments at the Battle of Roncevaux Pass. His horn, sword, and horse Veillantif became holy relics. Even the real Charlemagne, who likely never knew anyone named Roland, became a towering figure of legend, largely due to the popularity of the poem. The Song of Roland spread the archetype of the chivalrous knight far and wide, translated across Europe. It also contained the first known mention of the code of chivalry. Lines like "Roland was brave and his companions valiant," and "Roland was noble and his heart was high," embodied knightly virtues of courage, honor, and fealty that would define the ideals of nobility for the medieval world, however distant those ideals may have been from the grim reality. Another towering figure of knightly legend was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, better known as El Cid, an 11th century Castilian nobleman and military leader. His life and deeds were immortalized in the epic poem Cantar de Mio Cid, the Song of My Cid. A powerful warlord and tactician, El Cid fought both for and against Christian and Muslim rulers during the Reconquista in Spain. Despite this fluid allegiance to whoever paid him, he was depicted as the ultimate Christian warrior, defender of the faith against the Moors. The most famous legend around El Cid concerns the unique circumstances of his death and burial. In 1199, he died of grief shortly after his beloved city of Valencia fell to the Almoravids. According to the story, his wife Doña Ximena had his corpse strapped upright on his horse, dressed in full armor with his sword arm tied to the reins. The gates of Valencia opened, and the ghastly sight of the deceased hero riding out sent the terrified Almoravids fleeing in panic, allowing the Spanish to retake the city. El Cid's preserved body was then displayed for years in the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña as a holy relic and object of reverence. His warhorse Babieca, one of the most renowned steeds in literary history, was buried just outside the monastery grounds. Though much of El Cid's life story is lost to time and legend, his legacy as the Lord of Military Arts, an embodiment of Spanish chivalry, has resonated through the centuries. Perhaps no knight blended history and legend more than Richard I of England, immortalized as Richard the Lionheart. A paragon of the crusading knight, Richard's ferocity in battle and zeal for holy war became the stuff of lore. He was the Christian king that Muslim mothers warned their children about. A huge, strapping man clad in shining mail and capped with a golden crown, wielding a mighty sword or battle axe as he charged into the fray. This iconic image inspired both awe and terror. Virtually every aspect of Richard's life became mythologized. The story goes that his mother, Queen Eleanor, had the celebrated troubadour Bertrand de Born serve as his tutor, immersing Richard in the songs, lore, and ideals of knighthood from a young age. He was said to be unnaturally strong, able to straighten a horseshoe with his bare hands. His daring escape from captivity in Austria, where he had been imprisoned by Duke Leopold on his way back from crusade, became a thrilling tale of cunning and bravery. Richard's exploits in the Holy Land were particularly legendary. During the Third Crusade, he led the capture of Cyprus and a stunning victory against Saladin's forces at Arsuf. In a chivalrous exchange after battle, Saladin sent snow to help cool the fevered Richard in his sickbed. The king responded with the gift of his finest horse. Though they never met in person, Richard and Saladin's rivalry on the battlefield became a storied part of the Lionheart's myth. Tragically, Richard's glorious martial career came to an ignominious end in 1199. While besieging the castle of Chalus-Chabrol in France over a petty dispute about a treasure trove, the great warrior king was struck in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt. The wound turned gangrenous. On his deathbed, Richard magnanimously pardoned the young crossbowman and ordered him set free with a purse of gold. But the king's unforgiving lieutenants flayed the boy alive as soon as Richard died. Richard's entrails were buried at Chalus, his heart at Rouen, and his body at Fontevraud Abbey in the crypt next to his father Henry. For years after, the inscription on Richard's tomb read, "He was brave, far-sighted, munificent, and well-skilled in warfare. His end was lamentable, but his reputation has lasted through the ages." The chivalric ideals Richard embodied would endure too, however remote they may have been from the cruel realities of medieval combat. Indeed, for all the flowery tales of chivalry and valor associated with knighthood, the historical reality was often quite ugly. Many knights fell far short of the code of honor and were known more for ruthlessness than gallantry. One such ignoble figure was Raoul de Cambrai, a 10th century French nobleman whose story is told in an epic poem of the same name. In the tale, Raoul is portrayed as a young, impetuous knight driven by rage, greed, and bloodlust. Denied lands he believed were his birthright, he embarks on a rampage of vengeance, burning and pillaging his way across the countryside. In the town of Origny, his men brutally put the torch to a convent, burning 40 nuns alive inside, including Raoul's own cousin. Later, Raoul fights a judicial duel against the knight Bernier, his former squire who defected after Origny. Raoul is killed, and Bernier's family reclaims their fiefdom, suggesting some sense of justice. But the grim deeds in Raoul de Cambrai, however stylized, reflect the cruelty and mercilessness that many knights exhibited in warfare, far from the chivalric ideal. Pillage, slaughter, and atrocity were common tactics, as knights raided villages and towns with impunity, often against civilians and clergy. The horrors inflicted on non-combatants belied the notion of a knight as protector of the weak and innocent. This was especially true during the Crusades, when religious fervour added to the brutality. After the long siege of Antioch in 1098 during the First Crusade, the Crusaders unleashed horrific carnage, butchering civilians and prisoners without mercy. Even some Christian chroniclers were shocked by the slaughter, writing, "In Antioch, the amount of bloodshed was so great that our men waded in blood up to their ankles." Such was the grisly reality behind the glory of the Crusades. However, this grim truth could not quench the medieval world's fascination with tales of knightly valor and martial glory. A rich literary tradition of chivalric romances sprung up in the 12th century and flourished for hundreds of years. Drawing on older epic poems like the Song of Roland and Arthurian legends, these wildly popular tales spun fantastical stories of larger-than-life knights errant off on noble quests for love and glory, full of jousting tournaments, monsters and damsels in distress, Chivalric romances painted a dazzling mythical vision of knighthood. The greatest chivalric hero of all was King Arthur and his legendary Knights of the Round Table. Though Arthur was likely inspired by a real 5th or 6th century British warlord, there is little to no historical evidence for his existence or deeds. He was almost entirely a literary invention, whose story grew in the telling over many centuries. From Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain in the 12th century, to the epic poems of Chrétien de Troyes, to Sir Thomas Malory's seminal Le Morte d'Arthur in the 15th century, the Arthurian legend snowballed into a vast mythos. It encompassed a huge cast of indelible characters: the wizard Merlin, Guinevere, Lancelot, Percival, Galahad, and iconic elements like the Sword in the Stone and the Holy Grail. Each new version added richness and scope to the sprawling saga. At the center was always Arthur, the wise, valiant king who ushered in a golden age of Camelot. He gathered the greatest knights in Christendom at his round table, where all were equal in honor and nobility. From this hallowed seat, Arthur's knights rode forth on heroic adventures to save maidens, fight evil sorcerers, and seek the Holy Grail. It was an idealized world of shining castles, courtly love, and high chivalric deeds, far removed from the blood and muck of real medieval combat. The enduring appeal of the Arthurian romances lay in their ability to ennoble and inspire. They held up an idealized vision of the knight as a paragon of courage, honor, piety, and courtly manners. In this way, the mythical Knights of the Round Table embodied the perfect chivalric virtues that real knights could aspire to, even if they fell woefully short. The Arthurian tales and other romances helped spread the cult of chivalry across Europe. And of course, what better place to showcase those lofty knightly qualities than the tournament? Far more than mere military training exercises or sport, tournaments were elaborate public spectacles, a kind of medieval predecessor to pro sports. By the 13th century, they had evolved into huge, multi-day carnival-like events filled with pageantry, feasting, and martial games, drawing thousands of spectators. The tournament was the place for a knight to strut his stuff and build his reputation. Heralds would cry out the combatants' names and proclaim their heroic qualities as they took the field. Knights would deck themselves and their horses in their finest regalia, with colourful surcoats displaying their heraldic coats of arms. The ladies would watch from the stands, cheering on their champions and presenting favours to their chosen warriors. The jousting competition was the main event, where armoured knights on horseback would attempt to knock each other off with couched lances at full gallop. It was a thunderous, heart-stopping spectacle as the riders clashed in an explosion of splintered lances. A well-placed hit could send a knight tumbling from his mount into the dust. The last man seated would be declared the winner and crowned by a noble lady as the Queen of Love and Beauty. However, for all their pageantry and fanfare, tournaments were extremely dangerous affairs. Though the weapons were blunted, the combat was full contact and quite brutal. Serious injuries were common, and deaths not unheard of, even for the victors. In 1559, the French king Henry II died after his opponent's lance splintered and a shard punctured his eye through the visor. One can only imagine the trauma and survivor's guilt the other knight must have felt. But the risks of the tournament paled in comparison to the ultimate trial for any medieval knight: the experience of siege warfare. Sieges were agonizingly long, drawn-out affairs of sustained horror and misery, quite unlike the furious clash of battle. For the besieging army camped outside a castle's walls, It was a wretched existence of squalor, disease, and boredom punctuated by terror whenever the defenders unleashed a barrage of arrows, rocks, or boiling oil from the battlements. But if life was miserable for the besiegers, for those trapped inside the castle, it was a true nightmare. As food stocks dwindled, the inhabitants faced the slow, excruciating prospect of starvation. The account of the siege of Acre during the Third Crusade captures the hellish depths of deprivation. The heat, the flies, the corpses rotting in the streets, the lack of food, and above all water in the sweltering city created indescribable conditions. Men, women, and children were dying in droves. In the most desperate times, people ate anything to survive: cats, dogs, rats, animal hides, grass, and roots. One contemporaneous chronicler wrote of starving mothers eating their own babies. Others described crusaders cutting flesh from Turkish corpses to devour, or Christians drinking their own urine. Such was the price to endure a castle under siege, for commoner or knight alike. But perhaps the most feared and horrific aspect of siege warfare was the grim fate that awaited the defeated. If a besieged castle or town did not surrender in time, the victorious army would put it to the sack, a truly nightmarish orgy of violence, rape, and destruction. The attacking soldiers, whipped into a frenzy of bloodlust and greed, would rampage through the streets, slaughtering civilians, plundering everything of value and burning the rest. Even many knights, sworn to defend the innocent, would join in the atrocities with gusto. During the Crusades, it was common practice to enslave the civilian survivors or massacre them outright, men, women, and children alike. When Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in 1099, the blood from the wholesale butchery was said to run ankle-deep through the streets. One appalled chronicler described the scene. The knights tormented the population with innumerable tortures to make them show treasures they had hidden. Piles of heads, hands, and feet lay in the streets of the city. Men rode in blood up to their knees, nay, up to their horses' bridles. Amid such horrific carnage, some knights did uphold their chivalric vows, but they were the exception rather than the rule. In 1191, Richard the Lionheart had 3,000 Muslim prisoners executed in cold blood outside Acre, even as King Saladin chivalrously spared many Christian captives. When the Crusaders asked Saladin for the true cross, he replied, "I do not traffic in crosses, I traffic in men." This brutal sacking of cities exposed the vast gap between chivalry's noble ideals and the sometimes appalling behavior of knights on the battlefield. The indiscriminate massacre of civilians, fellow Christians at that, hardly matched the knightly image as pious defenders of the meek, but religious zealotry and dehumanization of the enemy led even elite warriors to commit unspeakable atrocities in the name of God. Such were the horrors and hypocrisies of holy war during the Middle Ages. And the Crusades marked both the apex of the age of chivalry and the beginning of its decline. The astounding successes of the First Crusade in capturing Jerusalem led to a surge in religious devotion and knightly fervor across Europe. The Crusader knight became the ultimate chivalric archetype, nobly sacrificing everything to fight for the glory of God. But the ugly realities of later crusades, defined by poor leadership, military failures, and horrific atrocities against civilians, led to growing disillusionment. The Christian knight's halo became permanently tarnished, especially after the catastrophic Fourth Crusade, which ended in the sack of Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, by the Fourth Crusade crusaders themselves in 1204. Subsequent crusades grew ever more fractured until the last Christian stronghold of Acre finally fell to the Mamluks in 1291, marking the ignoble end of the crusading era. By the 14th century, the age of chivalry was in irreversible decline as the realities of late medieval warfare increasingly eclipsed the knightly ideal. The rise of the longbow and pike war made the armoured cavalry charge, the iconic tactic of knights, an increasingly suicidal anachronism. At Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415, French knights learned this lesson the hard way, as they were annihilated by English archers long before they ever reached the enemy. The 100 Years' War accelerated chivalry's fall, as unchivalrous but effective weapons and tactics, from primitive cannons to hired mercenary companies, came to dominate the battlefield. In a bitter civil war that ravaged the countryside, the common peasantry suffered terribly and the mystique of knighthood was shattered. Real knights were a far cry from the shining heroes of Arthurian tales, and the brutal reality tarnished the romance of chivalry. The 15th century saw the last flourishing of chivalric culture with its fantastical romances and decadent tournaments, most lavishly, the month-long wedding celebration of Charles the Bold, which nearly bankrupted Burgundy, but it was more performance than reality by then. Amid the rise of gunpowder, the tournament of Saint-Anglevert in 1390 was another grand affair that showcased the pageantry and spectacle of the knightly tournament tradition. Organised by the French knight Jean Le Mangre, better known as Boucicaut, it brought together some of the most skilled and renowned knights from across Europe. For 30 days, knights competed in jousts and melees, their colourful banners and crests fluttering in the breeze as heralds announced the competitors. But as with any tournament, Saint-Anglevert saw its share of injuries and violence. The English knight Sir John Golafre suffered a broken arm in the jousts. In the Grand Melee, the crush of knights fighting in close quarters with swords and maces resulted in several more injuries, though fortunately none were fatal. The crowds gasped and cheered at each collision of lance and shield, thrilled by the spectacle, while perhaps not fully appreciating the pain endured for their entertainment. The most famous tale to emerge from Saint-Anglevert involves the English knight Sir Peter Courtenay. In the jousts, Courtenay's lance struck his French opponent squarely, but failed to shatter on impact. Accused of using an improper lance, Courtenay demanded a trial by combat to defend his honour as a true knight. A duel was arranged, but the French King Charles VI intervened, unwilling to let a foreign knight be potentially killed or maimed over a tournament dispute. The incident reveals the touchy nature of chivalric honour, where even a perceived slight could provoke a deadly duel. It also shows the precariousness of a knight's life. One bad fall, one errant lance in a friendly joust, could abruptly end a celebrated tournament career and a life. Knights like Courtenay risked everything each time they rode into the list, all for glory and acclaim that could prove fleeting. Many knights met untimely ends in the tournaments they loved. The famous English knight William Marshall, renowned as the greatest jouster of his age, finally retired from the lists after suffering a broken leg, ribs and collarbone in his 60s. The 13th century French knight Geoffroy de Breuil, known as the Leper for his scarred appearance, fell in a tournament near Cologne in 1252. A young squire named Wautier was killed in a joust during his knighting ceremony at Neuss in 1256. For every champion who basked in tournament glory, many more paid in blood. The knightly tournament evolved over time from a brutal mock battle to a more regulated and stylized extreme sport. By the 15th century, tournaments emphasized individual jousts over the chaotic melee, and complex rules governed the types of armor and weapons used to reduce fatalities. But the danger and the inherent violence of the tournament never disappeared entirely. Knights continued to charge at each other with solid lances, batter each other with blunted swords, and fall insensible from their horses, just as they had for centuries. The pageantry became ever more elaborate, the chivalric ethos romanticized and rarefied, but the core of the tournament remained a show of martial prowess, a test of skill, strength, and raw courage in the face of pain and potential death. The tournament was an essential part of knightly identity, both reflecting and reinforcing the centrality of ritualized, glorified violence to the medieval warrior elite. As the Middle Ages waned, the tournament began to decline. Firearms rendered the armored knight increasingly obsolete. The rise of the early modern state and professional standing armies reduced the social and military role of the semi-independent knight. The tournament became more of a self-conscious antiquarian revival than a practical training for war. In 1559, the French king Henry II died after a sliver of his opponent's shattered lance pierced his eye during a joust, a shocking reminder of the risks of the tournament. His death is often seen as a symbolic ending of the tournament tradition and a sign of its growing irrelevance. The elaborate pageantry and fanfare remained. Henry's fatal joust took place during his daughter's wedding celebrations, but the tournaments grew less frequent and less central to aristocratic warrior culture. The medieval knight and his tournament never entirely vanished. Jousting made a bit of a comeback in the Romantic era of the 1800s. To this day, modern jousts and Renaissance fairs revived the pageantry of the tournament tradition for education and entertainment. The image of the armored knight on horseback, lance in hand, remains one of the most recognizable symbols of the Middle Ages. But these modern revivals, as fun and fascinating as they are, sanitize the dark and dangerous reality of the medieval tournament. Underneath all the heraldic finery and chivalric posturing lay a world of warrior elites brutally battling for glory, honing their deadly craft and gambling with their lives for the roar of the crowd. The tournament was a microcosm of the knightly world in all its pageantry and poetry, as well as its harshness and hazards. The knight's path was a hard and perilous one, paved with pain more often than glory. Those who survived to old age bore the scars of a lifetime of combat, on the battlefield and in the lists. They rose each day, knowing it could be their last, that each clash of sword and lance could end in agony or death. And yet, year after year, tournament after tournament, they saddled up their war horses and rode out to fight again. Such was the way of the knight, steadfast in the face of danger, committed to the warrior's path, chasing honor and renown until the very end. As we've journeyed through the brutal world of the medieval knight, from their origins in the feudal system to their defining role in warfare and society, certain themes emerge again and again. The knight's life was defined by violence in their training, their tournaments, their bloody profession of arms. Death was a constant companion, whether charging into the thick of battle, laying siege to an enemy stronghold, or defending the walls of their own fortresses. The weapons and armor changed over the centuries, but the essentials of knightly combat remained the same. Close quarters fighting with sword, lance, mace, and axe, on foot and on horseback, in mud and blood. It was a world of clan and clanging metal, battle cries and dying screams, severed limbs and crushed bones. A knight had to make peace with pain and learn to deal it out in equal measure. We've seen how the realities of knightly warfare often clashed with the lofty ideals of the chivalric code. The gallant warrior fighting for God and glory, the noble protector of the weak and defender of the faith, remained powerful archetypes throughout the Middle Ages. But all too often, the knight fell short of these ideals, succumbing to the basest aspects of their warrior culture: brutality, greed, bloodlust, fanaticism. Many knights could be war criminals by modern standards, butchering prisoners and civilians, burning and pillaging with impunity. The Crusades in particular brought out the darkest impulses of some knights, fighting in the name of religion, but massacring whole cities, even cannibalizing fallen foes. War has a way of stripping away the veneer of civilization to reveal the barbarism beneath. But to judge the knight solely by modern morality misses something fundamental about the medieval world. These were brutal times by our standards. Violence was embedded into the very fabric of feudal society, which was organized for war from top to bottom. The knight was a product of that society, a society that demanded skilled warriors and rewarded them with land, status, and adulation. By the standards of their own time, knights were mostly fighting and behaving as they were expected to, as their training and their culture demanded. The chivalric code did have some restraining effect, encouraging clemency to noble prisoners, if not to common soldiers and civilians. Knights like William Marshal and Geoffroy de Charny, who truly tried to live up to chivalric ideals, were admired for it, even if they were the exception rather than the rule. And the influence of the knight and the chivalric ideal long outlasted the Middle Ages. The image of the noble warrior, the gallant horseman, the sword-wielding champion of the weak, still has a strong grip on our culture and our imaginations today. We see echoes in our modern obsession with superheroes and action stars, figures who fight against evil with skill and courage. The impulse to admire the warrior, to glorify martial prowess and valor, remains strong even in a world far removed from the medieval battlefield. The knight also left a powerful literary legacy, from the romances of Chrétien de Troyes to Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. The Arthurian tales in particular have resonated through the centuries, inspiring countless works of art, literature, film, and television. The Knights of the Round Table, Lancelot, Galahad, Gawain, and the rest, have become archetypal figures, embodying different aspects of the chivalric ideal. Their enduring popularity speaks to the deep hold that the image of the knight still has on us. In the end, the medieval knight was many things: warrior and nobleman, hero and villain, paragon and brute. They were products of a violent world, shaped by a culture that valorized martial prowess above all else. They fought and died in the mud and the blood, in the press of battle and the chaos of the melee. They suffered agonies large and small, bore scars and broken bones, lost friends and brothers to the butchery of war. But they also aspired to something higher, to an ideal of courage and honor, chivalry and faith. They sought glory in combat and in the tournament, to have their names celebrated in song and story. They strove, however imperfectly, to be more than just skilled killers, to serve a greater cause than mere bloodshed. The knight's tale is ultimately a human one, full of contradictions and complexities. It is a tale of trauma and transcendence, of savagery and sacrifice, of the heights and depths of the human experience on the medieval battlefield. And though the age of the armored knight on horseback has long passed, their legacy endures in our history, our culture, our myths, and our imagination. The clang of sword on shield, the thunder of charging hooves, the cries of "for God and glory" on the lips of the dying, these are the echoes of the knight's brutal world, still resounding through the ages. Despite the horrific realities that knights faced in war, their status and mythos lived on long after their often brief lives ended. Tales of valor and virtue were spun from even the grisliest episodes, polishing the knight to a shining symbol of chivalry that still captivates us today. The knight in shining armor, pure of heart and noble of deed, is of course more fable than fact. But this archetype had its roots in real men who often had to summon immense courage and conviction in the face of ghastly circumstances. That many fell short of the ideal does not negate the fortitude of those who sincerely strove to live up to its principles, even in the charnel fields of medieval warfare. Perhaps the most enduring knightly legends emerged from the court of Charlemagne in the 8th century. His elite warriors, the paladins, were celebrated in the epic poem The Song of Roland, which described their battles against the Moors in Spain. The most exalted of the paladins was Roland, Charlemagne's nephew, and the heroic martyr of the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass. Although Roland met a grisly end, blowing his horn in desperation as Basque fighters overwhelmed his rearguard. His defiant, self-sacrificing death immortalized him as the ultimate chivalric warrior. Embellished and romanticized, his legend spread across medieval Europe. Other knights won such fame for their martial prowess and outsized personalities that their renown bordered on the mythical. El Cid, the 11th century Castilian knight, was a paragon of both Christian and Muslim virtues for his integrity, valor, and chivalrous treatment of foes. Richard the Lionheart, the 12th century English king, earned his sobriquet for his audacity and courage on crusade, especially against his Muslim nemesis, Saladin. William Wallace, the 13th century Scottish rebel, achieved folk hero status for leading the underdog Scots in their defiant uprising against English tyranny. Edward the Black Prince, the 14th century English commander, was the very model of the valorous warrior, always leading his men from the front and treating captives with gracious chivalry. These men set the mold for the knights of literature and legend. In their most grandiose incarnation, we find them in King Arthur's court as the Knights of the Round Table, in high medieval romances like the 12th century Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart. Brave Lancelot must prove his devotion to Queen Guinevere through various trials and tribulations. The 14th century Middle English classic Sir Gawain and the Green Knight puts its hero through an allegorical test of his honor and piety in the face of temptation. Although these stories were largely invented, they gave definition to the virtues of the chivalric code at its most idealistic. That knights like Roland or Lancelot never existed quite as they did on the page doesn't diminish their imaginative power. The fact that some men even partially embodied their noble qualities was remarkable given the cruelty and brutality of the age. Then, as now, we needed exemplars to raise us up from the mire of human weakness and show us what we could be, even if we fell short of it. And so the knight in shining armor endures as an avatar of our highest aspirations, even as the realities of his daily existence and the horrors he endured on the battlefield slip further into the mists of time. When we think of knights today, it is not the gore-spattered warrior hacking his way through piles of corpses that springs to mind, but the pure-hearted Sir Galahad of Arthurian legend, finally attaining the Holy Grail through his perfect virtue. The chivalric knight is the ancestor of our modern superheroes, those champions of unimpeachable goodness that inspire us in dark times. And perhaps it is worth remembering that it was in the very darkest of times that the knight came closest to his own ideal, as a light in the barbaric world of the medieval battlefield. However fanciful or unrealized, we still need that gallant dream of the virtuous warrior, a bulwark against the basest cruelties of human nature. And so, as you drift off to sleep, I invite you to dream of knights, not of their grim, blood-soaked struggles in the muck and mire of medieval combat,